Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The dispatch board at Kel-Station Drifter glowed in 17 different colors depending on the urgency of the job, and Marin Voss had learned to read those colors the way sailors once read weather, with the particular literacy of a man whose rent depended on it. Red meant hazardous cargo, which paid well and smelled worse. Blue meant bureaucratic transfers, which paid poorly and involved a great deal of waiting in corridors while officials located their own stamps. Green meant standard commerce, the bread and butter, the kind of work that kept the humidity regulator in his cabin from being fixed, but also prevented it from getting any worse. Amber meant something the system couldn't cleanly categorize. And amber, in Marin's 3 years of experience on the station, meant either very good news or the specific kind of bad news that introduces itself as good news and only reveals its true nature after you've already said yes. At 22:40 on a Tuesday, the board offered him an amber. He was eating a protein compress that tasted like it had been designed by someone who had never personally eaten food but had read a thorough description of it. He was tired in the low-grade, structural way that comes not from one bad night, but from many adequate ones stacked consecutively. The kind of tired that doesn't show up on a medical scan because it has nothing to do with sleep. The cabin around him was small and functional, and featured a humidity regulator that produced a faint, rhythmic clicking sound every 40 seconds that he had long since incorporated into his resting heart rate. He looked at the amber job. He read the number next to the pay field. He put down the protein compress. The job description was lean, which he noted and filed under things to think about later. 1 sealed data capsule. Bio-authenticated. Hand delivery only. Private residential address in the Diplomats Tier. The Diplomats Tier was the topmost inhabited ring of Kel-Station Drifter, 7 levels above the commercial district, accessible by a single express lift that required a visitor's clearance code to operate. Marin had been up there twice in 3 years. Both times had felt like briefly visiting someone else's idea of how a space station should feel, quieter, smoother. The lighting calibrated to something that didn't make you aware of it, the way good lighting never does. The client name was listed as Thessaly or Diplomatic Attaché, Vethalesi Consolidated Reach. The contract was attached as a supplementary document, 47 pages long, filed in Vethalesi legal standard. His translation software rendered the title page and the first paragraph, and then apparently decided it had done enough. Because the rest came through in a font he didn't recognize, and a sentence structure that suggested the language had a complicated relationship with verb placement. He scrolled to the bottom, found the acceptance field, and pressed it. The time was 22:43. The Diplomats Tier smelled like imported air. He had never been able to prove this theory, but he maintained it with confidence, because the air up here had a quality, a faint, unprocessed, almost atmospheric warmth, that nothing recycled through a station's standard filtration system had any business producing. He walked the corridor with the data capsule under his arm and his cleanest jacket on his back, which was clean in the specific sense of having no stains that were legible in low light. The corridor itself was wide and surfaced in a dark composite material that absorbed both sound and the self-consciousness of people who weren't sure they belonged, which Marin found either thoughtful or aggressive depending on his mood. He found the address. He checked the number against the manifest. He pressed the notification panel and waited. The door opened and she was tall. That was the first thing. The second thing, arriving immediately behind it, was that she was already looking at him, not in the surprised way of someone answering an unexpected knock, but in the oriented, prepared way of someone watching something arrive that they scheduled. Her skin held a pattern of faint branching lines, tracing from her collarbones to her jaw in something that was almost bioluminescent and almost not, the kind of visual phenomenon that kept drawing your eye back the moment you thought you'd finished looking at it. Her hair was dark and moved with a quality of independent intention that didn't fully correspond to the air currents in the room. Her eyes were flat gold with no pupil he could locate, which gave her attention a completeness he found very difficult to hold for more than a few seconds without looking at something else. She had 4 fingers on each hand, each one slightly too long at the last joint, elegant in the way that small proportional incorrectnesses sometimes are. She stepped aside to let him in, one fluid, unhurried movement, the gesture of a person who has never in her life worried about whether the door would cooperate. He stepped past her threshold. The room was amber-lit and warm and furnished with objects that defeated his categorical instincts, things that might have been seats or storage or art, arranged with a logic he couldn't reverse engineer. He was already scanning for a surface to set the capsule on, already composing the 3-word version of this interaction in his head. Here, sign, thanks. The whole transaction could be done in 40 seconds if she was efficient, and she looked efficient. He didn't hear her touch the panel. He heard the door. The magnetic seal engaged with a resonance that moved through the floor and up through his boots and into his sternum, a sound with weight behind it, with intention, the sound of a mechanism that does not engage accidentally and does not disengage quickly. He turned. She was facing him, and whatever expression she'd had when she opened the door had completed its journey to somewhere else. His earpiece offered a translation of the words she spoke next in a tone of complete grammatical confidence that he would later describe as impressive given the circumstances. "You are mine for that night. This was arranged." Marin looked at the sealed door. He looked at her. He looked at the data capsule under his arm, which had seemed, until approximately 4 seconds ago, to be the most important object in the room. Outside, 7 levels below, the dispatch board was glowing in its 17 colors, amber and red and steady bureaucratic blue, entirely indifferent to the fact that one of its couriers had just delivered himself. There is a specific kind of silence that a person produces when they are working very hard not to say the first 17 things that come to mind. Marin Voss was producing that silence now, standing in the middle of a locked apartment in the Diplomats Tier with a data capsule under his arm and a translation still echoing in his earpiece. And the silence was enormous and had a shape, and the shape was approximately the shape of a man who had not read 47 pages of contract. She waited. This was, he would come to understand, a characteristic behavior. The Vethalesi capacity for patient waiting was not the tense, loaded waiting of someone holding something back, but the settled, architectural waiting of someone who has already decided that the outcome is going to be fine, and is simply allowing the other party time to arrive at the same conclusion. She stood in the amber light with her flat gold eyes and her branching lines and her 4 fingers on each hand, and she waited for him to finish not saying things, and he appreciated this more than he could have expressed at the time. "There has been," he said finally, with the careful diction of a man constructing a sentence the way you construct a load-bearing wall, "a translation error." She moved past him toward the curved seat and lowered herself into it in the unhurried way of someone settling in for a conversation they have been looking forward to. "The contract," she said, "was filed in triplicate Kel-Station Civil Registry, the Diplomatic Commerce Office, the Vethalesi Consular Bureau." She said this not unkindly, the way a doctor names bones not to alarm you, but because they are simply there and have names. "It is binding under 7 jurisdictions, including your station's standard labor compact." A pause. "There is no translation error." Another pause shorter. "There is perhaps a reading error." Marin sat down. He had not decided to sit down. His legs had convened briefly and reached a consensus without him. She explained. She spoke for 12 minutes in the low, evenly stressed voice of someone who has given a version of this explanation before and has refined it over iterations into something that covers all the relevant ground without unnecessary detours. The Vethalesi model of companionship and courtship, she told him, was organized around a service economy that predated their spacefaring history by several thousand years. The payment of money for time-based availability was not diminished by the transaction, it was constituted by it. To offer money was to say, "Your time is worth more to me than my own comfort." To accept was to say, "I will make time available." The contract he had signed through the automated dispatch board at 22:43 station time, she said, was a Category 4 companionship agreement. 8 hours of his personal time, purchased at premium rates. The data capsule was real. It did contain encrypted survey materials of diplomatic sensitivity, but it functioned in the contract as a procedural mechanism, because Kel-Station's labor dispatch system had no category for Vethalesi companionship agreements, and the courier framing was the closest available approximation. Marin looked at the data capsule on the table. He looked at it for a long time. "So the package," he said, "is real," she said, "but I'm also the package." "That framing is reductive," she said, "but not entirely inaccurate." He absorbed this. Outside, the station continued its rotation with the complete indifference of large structures to the problems of the individuals inside them. Somewhere 7 levels below, the dispatch board was probably glowing amber for someone else, and that person was hopefully reading their supplementary terms, and Marin felt toward that hypothetical person a surge of retroactive fraternal feeling. Read the contract, he thought. Read all 47 pages. Learn Vethalesi legal standard if you have to. Take a class. "How many people," he said, "know about this arrangement?" She considered this with the apparent sincerity of someone doing an actual count. 43, she said, "as of yesterday morning. Invitations have been sent." He looked at her. "Invitations." "There is a small celebration planned for tomorrow at the consular offices. A breakfast reception. My colleagues are quite pleased. A successful companionship contract at this stage of a diplomatic posting is considered a favorable sign. It reflects well on everyone." She paused. "You are the guest of honor." He put both hands over his face. Behind his palms, in the amber-warm dark of his own temporary retreat from the situation, he said, "There is going to be a party." "A modest one," she said, which he did not find as reassuring as she possibly intended. He lowered his hands. She was still watching him with that quality of attention that had no pupil to track, the total field awareness of gold irises that gave nothing away about where exactly they were focused, only that they were. His earpiece made the faint click that meant it was standing by, which he found almost companionable given the circumstances, like a small mechanical creature offering wordless moral support. He thought about the contract. He thought about the pay, which had seemed generous for a delivery, and which now made, he admitted, a different kind of sense. He thought about the 47 pages he had not read, and the sentence structure that had defeated his translation software, and the acceptance field at the bottom that he had pressed at 22:43 on a Tuesday with the breezy confidence of a man who had made this exact category of error before, and had simply never encountered a version with these particular consequences. "What?" he said, with the methodical tone of someone who has accepted that they are lost and is now interested only in obtaining accurate directions. "Does the contract actually require of me?" She looked at him in the way that might have been the Vethalesi equivalent of relief, if relief was a thing expressed through a slight reorientation of posture and a quality of voice that became, by some immeasurable degree, less formal. "Conversation," she said, "shared time, an honest account of your days and thoughts offered in exchange for the same from me." She paused. "Meals if you are willing, a game if you prefer structure." Another pause, and when she spoke again, she chose her words with the careful deliberateness of someone who has navigated a specific anxiety before and knows where the edge of it is. "The contract does not require anything that would necessitate prior medical documentation." The relief was so complete it briefly affected Marin's peripheral vision. "Right," he said. "Okay." He straightened in the seat. He rolled his shoulders once, the small physical ritual of a man resetting to operational. "I can do conversation." He looked around the room, at the amber light and the unfamiliar furniture and the sealed door and the data capsule on the table, and then he looked at her and he thought. 8 hours is 8 hours, and he had spent 8 hours in worse places for worse pay. "Can I ask," he said, "why me specifically?" She rose and moved toward the kitchen partition, where the frosted surface glowed warm behind her. "Your contract profile indicated prior experience with long-distance transit routes," she said, from behind the partition. "I wanted someone who understood what it means to travel between things rather than simply between places." There was a pause occupied by soft sounds he couldn't identify. "Also," she said, "you accepted without hesitation." "I didn't read it," he said. "I know," she said. "I found that interesting too." She brought 2 bowls from behind the partition and set one in front of him with the care of someone placing something that matters. The contents steamed gently and smelled like something he didn't have a word for, not any specific food he recognized, but the abstract idea of warmth made edible, which he understood was not a useful description, but was the most accurate one he had. He looked at it. He looked at her. She had already picked up her own bowl and was waiting, not impatiently, just waiting. In that way she had that made waiting seem like a perfectly reasonable thing to be doing. He picked up the implement she had set beside the bowl, which was not quite a spoon and not quite anything else, and he tried a small amount of whatever it was, and it tasted the way a question feels when you're not ready to answer it but you're glad someone asked. "It's good," he said, which was true and also the least interesting true thing he could have said, but she received it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who prepared for something and had it work out. Outside the apartment's single narrow viewport, Kel-Station Drifter was doing what it always did at this hour, which was rotate slowly against a backdrop of deep transit lanes that glowed faint blue from the corridor markers of ships too far away to resolve into shapes. Just light, just movement. The station's long ongoing conversation with the dark. Marin had looked at that view from 7 levels below for 3 years, and it had stopped meaning anything. The way the humidity regulator's clicking had stopped being a sound. But from up here it looked different, slower, maybe, or more deliberate, as if the Diplomats Tier had a different relationship with the passage of time, which he suspected it actually did, financially speaking. "Tell me," she said, "what you were doing before the dispatch board sent you here." He told her. He started with the protein compress and the amber glow, and the way the number in the pay field had looked at 22:40 on a Tuesday after a week of green jobs and a humidity regulator that had recently developed a second clicking sound in a slightly different rhythm. So now the 2 clicks were almost but not quite syncopated, which was somehow worse than 1 click would have been. He told her about the lower commercial tier and the 2-bunk cabin. 1 bunk was his. The other served as a surface for things that had not yet found their permanent place, which at this point included most of his possessions. He told her about the long routes, the ones that took him through the mid-ring transfer corridors, where the station's structural ribs were visible through maintenance windows, and you could feel, briefly, the actual size of the thing you were living inside. He told her about clients who signed for their packages without looking up from their screens, and clients who looked at the package before they looked at him, and the rare ones who looked at him first, which he always found surprising, like a courtesy he hadn't budgeted for. She listened in a way that had weight, not the polite performative listening of someone managing a conversation, but the actual thing, the kind where you can feel your words landing somewhere rather than dispersing into the air. Her branching lines moved faintly in the amber light as he spoke, a slow, almost tidal rhythm that he found himself pacing his sentences to without deciding to. "You are not unhappy," she said when he had finished, "but you are not yet located." He turned the word over, located. "Oriented in relation to what you intend," she said. "You know where you are, you do not yet know toward what." She considered for a moment. Like a ship that has established its position but has not yet filed a heading. He wanted to push back on this. He reached for the materials to do so and found mostly air. That's a lot of conclusion from a story about a protein compress and a broken humidity regulator, he said. Yes, she said, without apparent embarrassment. I am an attaché. Drawing large conclusions from small evidence is a professional qualification. He laughed despite himself, a short involuntary sound, and she tilted her head at the same 4-degree angle she'd used earlier, and he was beginning to understand was not skepticism but interest, the physical notation of something she was filing away. Your species, she said, uses humor to discharge tension. I have read about this. I find it very efficient. We also use it to avoid answering questions, he said. Yes, she said. I have read about that too. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. Given that he was in a locked apartment in a station tier he barely had clearance for, on a contract he had signed without reading, with a woman whose species had apparently organized their entire romantic culture around labor law. By any reasonable accounting, the evening should have had a different texture. Instead, it had the quality of something that was taking its time, which was either the consequence of very good food or of being genuinely engaged, and he had enough self-awareness to suspect it wasn't only the food. Your turn, he said. She looked at him. You asked about my days, he said. That means I get to ask about yours. That's how conversation works, even under contract. Something moved across her expression that he was beginning to learn to read. A slight shift in the set of her jaw, a quality of stillness that preceded speech the way a conductor's held breath precedes the downbeat. I have been on Kel-Station Drifter for 3 rotations, she said. Before that, the Meridian outpost. What did you decide? He asked. To take the posting, she said, which I had already done. The light delay made my mother correct before I was. She looked at him steadily. This happens more than people account for in deep transit. Time is not the same at distance. No, he said quietly, thinking of something he didn't name. It isn't. The station turned. The transit lane lights moved in slow procession past the viewport, blue-white and patient. Somewhere in the lower tiers, a docking alarm sounded twice, and then stopped, as they always did, swallowed by the station's ambient sound before they could become interesting. Marin looked at the data capsule sitting on the table between them, small and sealed and containing, apparently, the kind of information that required 8 hours of cover story to protect. And he thought about the fact that she had built tonight around 2 genuine needs, and had the architectural efficiency to address both simultaneously. And he thought this was either very cold or very practical, or possibly both, and possibly also something he didn't have a word for yet, in any language his translation software could render. The capsule, he said, the survey data inside it, is it going to cause problems when it goes to the formal handoff? She was quiet for a moment. 2 of the 3 parties will be unhappy, she said. The transit lanes run where the lanes run. The survey does not have a diplomatic conscience. She set her bowl down carefully. This is what the work is, most of the time. Delivering true things to people who would prefer a different truth, in language careful enough that they can accept it without it feeling like a defeat. She looked at him. You do a version of this. He considered arguing that delivering data capsules was not the same as delivering geopolitical realities, and decided the distinction was less robust than he'd assumed. I mostly just hope no one's home, he said. Her harmonic laugh came again, layered and low, and again it was different from anything he'd imagined it might be, and better. At some point between 3 and 04:00 station time, Marin stopped tracking the hours. This was not a thing he did. He was, by professional habit and personal temperament, a man who tracked hours. Hours were the unit of his livelihood. The time a job took, the time until the next one, the time remaining on a contract, the time his humidity regulator had been clicking before he gave up expecting it to stop. He tracked hours the way some people tracked money or approval, as a continuous low-level audit of where he stood in relation to the day. but somewhere in the middle of a conversation about whether artificial gravity had changed the way people dream. She believed it had. He was skeptical. They agreed they were both guessing. He looked at his watch and found that he didn't particularly care what it said, which was new information about himself that he filed away without comment. She had made something warm to drink around 2:0, a Vethalesi preparation that came out of a device he didn't recognize operating on principles he couldn't identify, producing a result that tasted faintly mineral and faintly sweet and sat in the chest with the comfortable weight of a decision you've stopped second-guessing. He had accepted it without asking what was in it, which she noted with what he now recognized as her version of approval, that slight reorientation of posture, the branching lines settling into a slower rhythm. He was learning her tells. He was aware that he was learning her tells, and that this was the kind of thing that happened when you paid attention to a person for several consecutive hours. And he was aware also that he had not paid this quality of attention to anyone in longer than he wanted to accurately calculate. They had covered considerable ground. The light delay problem of deep transit communications, and what it does to relationships conducted across that distance. How you send a version of yourself into the dark and receive a response addressed to someone you were 3 weeks ago, so that every exchange is partly a conversation with your own past self, which she found philosophically interesting and he found quietly exhausting. The question of whether Kel-Station's architecture was the product of a culture that feared empty space or simply hadn't decided yet what to put in it. The taxonomy of difficult deliveries. He had stories she listened to with the focused appreciation of someone collecting data, and she had stories about diplomatic handoffs gone wrong that were objectively more consequential than anything he'd experienced, but told with the same dry economy he used for his own, which meant they landed as equals rather than comparisons. Around 4:30 he told her about the other bunk. He hadn't planned to. It came out of something she said about the transit junction posting, and the accumulated texture of being somewhere that didn't require you to explain yourself to anyone. And he heard himself say that his cabin had 2 bunks, and that the second one had belonged to a colleague who'd left the station 14 months ago for a permanent posting on a core world hub, and that he had not repurposed the bunk since then, which he characterized as a storage decision, and which she received in silence for a moment before saying, very carefully, that she understood. And the way she said it made clear that she understood the thing he had actually said, and not the thing he had called it. The humidity regulator, she said after a moment. What about it? You said it developed a second clicking sound recently, a different rhythm. She looked at him. How recently? He thought about it. 15 months approximately. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked at the viewport, where the transit lane markers were doing their slow procession, and he thought about what it meant that he had incorporated a sound into his nervous system rather than fix it, had made it ambient, had let it become part of the texture of a space he was no longer sharing. And he thought about the fact that it had taken a locked door in the Diplomats Tier and an alien diplomat with a Category 4 contract to sit him down long enough to notice this about himself. The capsule, he said, to change direction. Yes. You should read it tonight, before I leave. Whatever's in it, you should have your full night with it. She was quiet for a moment. The handoff is at 090, she said. I have time. Read it anyway, he said. You built tonight around 2 things. Don't let one of them not get done. Something in her expression completed itself. She reached across the table and took the data capsule, and her too long 4th finger pressed the bioauthentication surface, and the capsule opened with a soft depressurization sound, like a small exhale, and she began to read. He did not ask what it said. He sat with his warm drink and watched the transit lanes and let her work, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that means 2 people are in the same room on purpose. At 5:50 she set the capsule down. 2 of them will be unhappy, she said. You said that already. Now I know which 2. He looked at her. Are you going to be all right with the handoff? She looked back at him steadily. I am very good at delivering true things in careful language, she said. It is what I do. A pause. You asked because you wanted to know, not as conversation. Yes, he said. That is different from how you spoke at the beginning of tonight, she said. He didn't argue with this because it was accurate. At 6:55 she rose and went to the door panel. He put on his jacket and picked up the data capsule, which was now empty of its survey data and of its function as a cover story, and was simply a small metal object he was carrying for no particular reason, except that he had arrived with it, and it seemed wrong to leave it behind. She pressed the release. The magnetic seal opened with the same resonance it had made closing, and he had been right the first time he thought it. The sound was different now, not a full stop, something with more room in it. He stood in the threshold. She stood at the panel. 7 levels below, the station was beginning its version of morning, the commercial tiers lighting cycling up, the early shift couriers pulling jobs from the board in amber and green and red. The breakfast reception, he said. Begins at 080, she said. I need a better jacket. Yes, she said, without hesitation. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And 8 hours of time he had apparently sold without knowing it had turned out to contain more than he had known how to buy, which was something he was going to have to think about in the lift on the way down, and possibly for some time after that. He had arrived here as a courier who hadn't read his contract, a man moving between things rather than toward them, carrying something that turned out to be less important than himself. He was leaving with an empty capsule and a better question than any he'd arrived with, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, the most valuable thing he'd transported in 3 years, and it had never been in the package. 8-0, he said. I will save you a seat, she said. He walked out into the corridor and the door behind him didn't close immediately. He heard it stay open for a few seconds longer than required, a small structural hesitation, as if the evening wasn't quite ready to end. Then it closed softly, and he walked toward the lift alone in the corridor's hushed, expensive air. And by the time the lift doors opened, he was already thinking about where, on Kel-Station Drifter, a courier found a better jacket before 8. On a Wednesday morning, he had 1 hour